I think that one of the things that we found in the study is that people will be much more comfortable connecting to other people who disclose personal information, right? And it doesn't have to be deeply intimate personal information, right? By the way, cute dog pics are a very, very hot commodity. And, if you have a cute dog and you want to post pictures of them, that's a very good strategy because people always love them and they feel like they know you and they feel connected to you.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. The office culture has a variety of components to it, but one of the more compelling is that boundary between colleagues inside of the office, but also being friends outside of it. It is a challenge because it can blur the lines of what is normally accepted. Wharton's Nancy Rothbard was part of research done in 2022 on this topic, which remains at the forefront of office etiquette. And Nancy joins us right now. Nancy, great to talk to you again. How are you?
Great, Dan. Wonderful to talk with you.
What was it that drove you in the first place to look at this as an important area?
Well, I've been obsessed actually over the last few years with online social media and how it is fundamentally transforming our work relationships as well as our non-work relationships. But I'm primarily interested in the work relationships and how we interact with people at work.
And so this was in part looking at the information that employees collected in the course of working with others.
Yes, so we did several studies where we asked people about their interactions with people at work. We asked them to recollect various situations that they had found themselves in, and we also asked them about current situations. We also relied on an archival data set that was a nationally representative sample around how people used social media at work.
How has the influx of social media in our lives every day kind of impacted that work process that we have on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think one of the things that was really interesting to us was just the prevalence of it, right? Most people are using some form of social media to connect with their colleagues in some way or another. And what that social media form is might vary across person and across type of role, across generation. There are different platforms that are more prevalent with college age students or younger employees, and others that are more prevalent with older employees, right? And so it can vary what platform you're using, but by and large, people are connected with their colleagues on one of these platforms very often.
And as you kind of alluded to, that relationship in terms of the role that each person has within the company, within the office, that becomes, I guess, kind of an important, point of focus of who maybe you do or do not get in touch with outside of the office.
Absolutely. As we started to really examine these questions, we actually first started with some interviews with people. And one of the things that really struck me when we were talking with people about this phenomenon was that the hierarchical boundary between levels in organizations, right, boss, subordinate, really was powerful. It came up a lot in terms of how people thought about these questions. They might be very comfortable connecting with peers, but then very uncomfortable connecting across levels. And one of the funniest things to me was when we would talk to people about this, a lot of times they would equate connecting with somebody on, connecting with a boss on something like Facebook or Instagram as equivalent to connecting with their mother, right? It was sort of the same horror that they would express as they talked about those relationships.
All right. So then how should both companies and the employees think about that process? Because there are some dynamics that probably could get a little tricky along the way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of companies, for example, have social media policies. And it's not necessarily who you're connecting with typically, but more what you are posting, or are you allowed to post stuff about work or about people at work? Or sometimes it is about who you're allowed to connect with, right? So that there's no conflicts of interest. And so there are policies that some organizations have. But what I would also say is that connecting on social media is also a way of just, especially throughout the last couple of years where we've engaged in more remote work, more hybrid work, it's also an opportunity to know what's going on in people's lives, right? So just banning it entirely may not be the right approach. One has to think about judiciously who do you connect with, and what do you disclose to them, and what is that relationship that you're willing to cross that boundary, so that you're willing to blur the line between professional and personal.
Well, one of the things I found interesting is that you also talk about this element of self-disclosure, and the fact that that can kind of ease and better the opportunity to have a relationship or a friendship outside of the office, when somebody is maybe talking about their kids or talking about the traffic, or some component outside of what would normally be discussed in terms of the business.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that we found in the study is that people will be much more comfortable connecting to other people who disclose personal information, right? And it doesn't have to be deeply intimate personal information, right? By the way, cute dog pics are a very, very hot commodity. And, if you have a cute dog and you want to post pictures of them, that's a very good strategy. Because people always love them, and they feel like they know you, and they feel connected to you, and it gives them a sense of warmth that you're displaying, and a feeling that they know something about you that's important, and that's not fake, or surface level. And so that personal disclosure really helps to create a bond between you and your fellow coworkers.
How do you think then that potentially impacts the culture within the office? Because for a long time, I remember you used to hear the old story, don't talk with your boss outside of the walls. Once you leave for the day, that's it, you're done. But it seems like that's changing a little bit.
So I think that has changed a little bit, but what we also found in the study was a gender difference in terms of the expectation around self-disclosure and disclosure of personal information. So we found it, we found a very complex three-way interaction effect between whether you're a boss, and a boss versus a peer, for example, and whether you are disclosing or not, and your gender. And so what we found was that women who disclosed more personal information were that really helped them. Actually, that helped people, women bosses who disclose personal information, people really responded positively to that. For male bosses, interestingly, that personal disclosure didn't help as much, and in fact, sometimes what people would say, we actually had both quantitative and qualitative data in these studies, and one of the quotes that I'll never forget is, somebody was saying about a male boss who disclosed personal information, I found it creepy, like, and other comments about some of these male bosses were like, is he trying to spy on me, right? So it wasn't quite as benign in terms of how it was interpreted when it was a male boss who was disclosing. So interestingly, women bosses, like this is one way in which gender role stereotypes around warmth and disclosure and connection were helping women bosses to kind of be connected with others.
But if to a degree, we've kind of opened up this, I don't know if Pandora's box is the right term to use, but we've kind of opened it up when you think about remote work and messaging channels, and the fact that in many cases, messaging channels aren't just about work anymore. There's usually a channel about what's going on in your life as well. So we've, with technology, kind of brought this to the front.
Absolutely. And some people really are very comfortable with that and really embrace it, and they love the blurring of the work non-work boundary, and they just feel like this is a way to make, create a work family, right? Whereas other people feel less comfortable with that approach, and I've done a lot of work on what I call integrators versus segmenters, and integrators are the ones that are very comfortable with blurring that boundary, where segmenters want to keep that bright line between the personal and the professional, and they feel really a lot of distress when that line is crossed. And so you have to really pay attention as a colleague to how other people how they like to interact around this, and understand that your preference may not be their preference. And so respecting their boundaries may be also an important element to keep in mind.
I mentioned you did this research in 2022, but here we are a couple of years later. What did this research tell you then, but also how this process has kind of developed over the last couple of years?
Well, I mean, I actually did this research both during and post pandemic. Okay. So I will say that, it's been, I've actually had a lot of different times in which the research was done. And I think that it's become this connection, this social connection via social media and online platforms has become in some ways even more important in the world we're living in now, where there is a lot, as you say, more platforms, more remote work, more hybrid work, where we need to find ways to connect in meaningful ways with our colleagues. And we're not always just standing around the water cooler. And so we have to find those ways to feel like we've gotten to know people. And so sometimes the online social media provides a channel with which we can really deepen those relationships in a way that is also giving equal access to people, right? Where some people might be, working more remotely than others, but, having that access to what's going on in people's lives can help you form and build lasting relationships.
Nancy, great to talk to you as always. Again, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you. Nancy Rothbard, management professor and deputy dean here at the Wharton School.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.